Chocolate? Chocolate! Chocolate!
Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome back to another countdown. In this one, I'm gonna rank every Owl House Season 1 episode in celebration of the release of the second episode of Season 3, For the Future. Owl House is a show I hadn't seen until recently, because for a while I wasn't watching a ton of newer animated shows. But after a long time of hearing great things about it, and more recently hearing buzz around thanks to them, I finally decided to check it out. And wow, it's been fantastic. I love the world and the great stories the show tells, while messing around with fantasy tropes. And the characters are so extremely interesting. The character writing is incredible, especially for Luce, Amity, and Ida, but all the other characters are great as well. The show on top of that has amazing LGBTQ representation through the Lumity relationship and some other things, really pushing some boundaries for children's media in the best way, especially for a Disney Channel show. I thoroughly enjoyed watching the show throughout, and have loved the overarching story as well, especially the crazy twists and turns it took at the end of Season 2, and thanks to them. And I'm so excited to see where the show goes next with all these elements in For the Future. My love for the show made me want to review it almost immediately after I finished watching. So I decided, instead of doing a top 5 list, why not rank all the episodes in the first 2 seasons? And obviously I'll discuss the third season's 3 episodes in a later video when it's done airing. Why am I doing a ranking on all the episodes instead of a top 5, you may be asking? Well, because I just want to talk about everything. Owl House is a one-of-a-kind show because of the reasons I just mentioned, and there's something interesting to say about nearly every episode. Also, I want to do more rankings going forward, as I usually want to talk about the entire season for most seasons I cover, but have kind of gotten stuck doing the top 5 format that I started with. Anyways, I'm not gonna say a ton about Season 1 in general, as I'm gonna be talking about every episode, so any general points on the season I want to make, I'll probably make somewhere in the video, but just as a short summary of my overall thoughts, the season is really good. It's not a great season, as there are a number of episodes I'm not super crazy about. The season takes a little time to find its footing, and Season 2 really blows this one out of the water in terms of overall quality, but when the season does find its footing, it has all those strengths I mentioned earlier, even if less so than later on, and a lot of episodes are really good to great for that reason, with there being some truly phenomenal episodes, especially near the end of the season, which are some of the best of the show. And we're gonna talk about all the episodes in this countdown. So with all that said, here is my list of every Owl House Season 1 episode ranked. I know many of you were expecting me to put one very particular episode at the bottom of this list, and are surprised to see really small problems here. But I'm gonna be honest, this is the only episode of the entire show I consider to be bad. Now, to be fair, it is not that bad, because there are some cute and fun moments throughout with King and Luce, and the ending sequence of them being trapped with all the tiny animals is also fun for the most part. I also think Ida's subplot is funny for how short it is, but this episode has some major problems. The first being this episode is just boring, cause the story fails at nearly everything it tries to accomplish. The King and Luce conflict is way too simple, especially compared to other Season 1 episodes, and it's uninteresting for this reason. At the end, King just point blank says what his issue is, and this is a problem with some other Season 1 episodes, but it's specifically worse here because of how painstakingly simple the story already is. And this is made much worse by the fact that the character writing here is awful. And this is such a shame because there are so many other episodes, even weaker ones this season, with more simple stories that are brought up by great character writing. But in this episode, both Gus and Willow feel really one note and out of character, because of how badly they treat King and how oblivious they are to him wanting to spend time with Luce. But Luce also feels kind of out of character here, with just how oblivious she is with the way King is treated and how he's feeling. And I feel like King's worst attributes are also played up here, to make him not fun to watch. The character writing issues make it even harder to get into such a bare bones story. And then they add the liar revealed moment in this episode when Luce figures out that King shrunk her friends, and it falls completely flat because all the characters aren't written well. It also makes the ending so infuriating because they try to act like King was the only one in the wrong in this situation, and yeah, he was probably the most wrong out of everyone, but both Gus and Willow also have stuff to apologize for, and they don't really say anything. The shrinking stuff in this episode is also used in an uninteresting way, besides the climax as I said, when in other episodes that have a magic gimmick like this, or mess around with a fantasy story trope, it usually is really interesting, but not here, and that sinks the fun gimmick this episode had. On top of that, most of it is just boring montages that aren't really fun or funny like in other Owl House episodes. The setting isn't that interesting either, and Tibble's revenge story is also just nothing remarkable at all because Tibbles is kind of a bland villain. So yeah, well there's some nice things here, despite these issues, and I know some people think this episode is really fun, but for me, it's just mildly annoying and kind of a bore to sit through, and easily the worst of the season for that reason. So the next chunk of episodes are ones I think are okay, but definitely have things holding them back from me calling them good. Escape of the Palisman is the worst episode in this category because everything here is literally the definition of okay. The main story is okay, and nearly everything else that happens is as well. I just don't feel strongly about this episode, one way or another, when everything moving forward has some sort of good element that's enough to push it above this one. And the reason for all of this is just that I don't find the story in this episode super interesting one way or the other, as they don't do a ton with it. And where the story does go isn't bad necessarily, but it isn't good either. The setup to this episode is good though. You get some fun Luce moments, and you get to learn more about the world, even if it is a small part of the episode, and is nothing super special within the season. The subplot, in contrast, is fine. I never wanted to see King take advantage of Eda in this way, but it's within his character to do so, and we get some good jokes, and it's cool that they show Eda's curse getting worse, but they don't do too much with it, leading to this portion of the episode also being kinda dull. You do learn some interesting things about the Bat Queen here, and there are some fun moments as Luce goes through this trial, but all this doesn't change how dull and middle of the road the rest of the episode is, and the Bat Queen is a much better character later on. So yeah, even with some good things, this episode still makes me feel indifferent when I have more positive opinions on everything coming up, even if it's not by that much. So at number 17, we have the first episode of the show, and it's another one I feel more indifferent to, but I think there are some pretty good things here that put it above Escape of the Palisman. But as a first episode goes, this one is rough. The setup for this episode and show is kinda generic, Luce's problems at home, how she gets to the world, and some of her initial interactions with it, and the reason she wants to stay is all kinda cliche, and they don't do enough unique stuff to make any of it stand out in a super interesting way. The world and characters also aren't super fleshed out here, especially Luce, who is nowhere near as interesting in this episode as she is later on. And I know that is more of a minor problem because it's the first episode and the characters and world of course aren't going to be as fleshed out, but I think these issues lead to the plot and message of the episode also being super simple and nothing special. But with all that said, I like this adventure. I think it's pretty fun when they break into the Conformatorium, and even if this message is simple and kinda cliche and they don't do a lot with it, it's still a nice message. There's actually some funny twists in the episode as well, and some really funny moments throughout. And the final fight is pretty good, along with some of the one-off characters being kinda cool, even if they're not used super well here, or really throughout the rest of the show, besides one particular one. Also, Ida and King are actually more fleshed out here than you would expect so early on. So, with there being quite a bit I don't like, and an amount that I do, it also falls in the okay camp, but I did overall enjoy this one more than I didn't. As a first episode goes, it does get you interested in the show, but doesn't get you hooked at all. So take that as you will, but either way, it's still worse than nearly every other episode in the season, including the very next one. Now this one isn't that much better than last episode, as they're very close in quality, and I know some people even consider this one to be worse. As I said, this season takes a little time to find its footing, but I still do consider this to be better, as the good things here are overall stronger, especially one big thing. But the drawbacks of this episode are that it tries to throw you for a loop after the first episode and subvert your expectations of what you think this fantasy world would be like, but it doesn't do that in an interesting way. And episode 1 kind of already did this, along with every episode after this one having more fun with this idea as well. This episode also doesn't have much of a story. It's just kind of watching Luce go through some fantasy cliches that turns out to be a trap, and not much happens other than that. It also takes too long to get going, and the message is once again spelled out and kinda cliche, even if I think it's more interesting than the last episodes. But with all this said, what I think brings this episode up a lot is that there are some really funny moments. The ending conflict is cool. I do like the monster they fight and how Luce has to overcome it. And the big plus in this one is Luce's characterization here. She is so fun to watch, and way more interesting than last episode. You get to learn more about her throughout the story, which really endears you to her character, and makes this episode, even with its hiccups, more interesting and fun to watch. The other characters are also more fun and interesting in this episode as well. So even with all the issues I have, great character writing really brings up this deeply flawed episode. Well, it's still only okay, and one of the season's weaker episodes. It's an indication early on in the show of how good the character writing can be, and if it can bring up a pretty mediocre episode this much, it makes you curious what it could do for a good or even great episode, and this season really gets going after this one. So this should be interesting. Many of you probably expected this to be at the bottom of the list, and the fact that not only is that not where it landed, but it's not even in the bottom 4 might seem wrong to some of you. But I do like this one an amount more than the episodes I've just talked about. Look, I get why people don't like this one, and trust me, there's a lot wrong with it. For starters, the body swap cliche is a fun one that this episode doesn't do enough with. While these stories are enjoyable, none of them are that fun or use this concept in a really creative way. And this leads to some pacing issues because the stories aren't that interesting for how simple they are, and the episode can be dull at points for this reason. I think an easy fix to this would have been to cut between the stories to break them up and flesh out some ideas a bit more. Now those are the big issues with this episode, with what it tries to accomplish, but I also think this episode is a missed opportunity in many ways. We could have gotten some interesting character development through each of these characters exploring each other's lives. Specifically, Luz and Ida, who are so different but share some interesting similarities that they dive into in other episodes. And this is a smaller point, but they missed a great opportunity to have different voice actors play different characters. Like Ida would be played by King's voice actor Alex Hirsch, and so on and so forth. That's usually part of the fun of doing an episode like this. But with all that said, for what the episode actually tries to accomplish, that being 3 fun body swap stories that connect at the end, I did overall enjoy myself. Not enough to call it good, but even with its problems, I enjoyed each story for the most part, and there were some funny moments throughout. While they do try and do some more plot-related stuff later in the episode that falls flat in this context, for the most part, all this episode tries to do is be dumb fun. Problems and all, it does a better job at being a fun one-off story than what the previous episodes did with what they tried to accomplish. Not a good episode, but far from the worst of the season in my opinion. This is an episode that grew on me watching it again. I still don't think it's a good episode, but it's right on the cusp of being one, as there is a lot I like here. I like Luz a lot in this episode. It's really fun at first to see how passionate she is about this competition and the ideas she comes up with. Her disagreements with King at first are also pretty funny. And the most interesting part of this entire story is Luz's response to everything. How she struggles with her feelings towards King, and this leads to a great scene between them when he asks her to help him write again due to her really genuine reaction. The second half of this episode in general is pretty good, if nothing too interesting because of this, along with the story taking some turns that are fun. There's also pretty good ending conflict, and they do make an interesting point on how unrealistic some expectations for writers are and what it can lead to, even if it's not super in-depth or really that interesting. But moving away from the main story for a second, the subplot is the clear highlight. While it's pretty simple and a small part of the episode, it's cool we get to see more of the two sisters' dynamic in a fun way while developing their relationship a little bit, along with having some good gags. But with all these good things I have to say, what I fail to mention is the main story isn't very good, for the most part. While I like some of King and Luz's exchanges, I think this setup is cliche, and the first part of this conflict is as well. The way Luz and King fall out with each other, and King in general in this episode, just isn't super interesting. They don't do much new with this kind of story, or mess around with the cliches of it all, until later in the episode. And even with the good things I said about that part of the episode, the story just isn't super interesting throughout, despite some good turns the episode takes. The reason King needs Luz later in the episode is just really generic as well, even if the scene is pretty good. And while I like the final conflict, the conversation they have when they make up just doesn't work because of the problems the episode has. Even if they more cleverly incorporate King kinda stating the obvious issue he's dealing with. While the episode has a lot of good things in it, there's nothing I like enough for me to call it good due to its issues. but it was so close, and is the last episode on the list that I consider to be okay. Which means... So this is the first episode I consider to be good. Well, not anything fantastic, all things considered, and the biggest compliment I can give it is that it's a decent episode. I do overall like this one. I think the setup and premise of the episode is fun, even if the episode can feel like a kinda cliche magic summoning story at points, as they don't do as much with the cliche of conjuring something by accident as I think they could have, and I also think the setup of Luz being afraid of getting caught by Ida and not wanting to lose her trust is also kind of generic and not a super interesting or fun way. But they do have some fun with this story, which leads to some funny gags, good moments throughout between Gus, Luz, and Willow, along with a cool twist or two to make the story a little more interesting, even if it's not enough still to make the episode super special or really that engaging, as the stakes throughout are kinda low, especially in comparison to other episodes. But these characters still have something they're trying to prove, meaning there are still some stakes, and the episode is fun enough to where this isn't a huge issue, and on top of that, the episode has some decent character development on Willow. The subplot is also fine, but nothing special, and doesn't connect to the main story really at all, but it has some good gags as well. So this is an episode, while I don't have super strong feelings about it, and certainly have my issues with it as well, that's not enough to bring down the episode too much, which is why it's an enjoyable experience and better than the episodes I've talked about so far, but pales in comparison to everything higher on the list. This is the first really good episode on the list, and the first of many we will talk about. There are many things I really like about this episode. I like the setup to the story a lot, and the reason why Luz goes back to school, and how Gus gets her to go there. I think it's very fun, and I like a lot of the plot beats of this story, and many individual scenes as they go around the school, especially the really fun climax. We also get to learn more about the school and different kinds of magic in the episode, which is really cool. We get development on that here. This episode also has some really good jokes, but the thing I love the most about this episode is Ida's subplot. It is simple, but through it we get to see more into Ida's character and past. The episode really shows how much she cares for Luz and how she realizes the school is good for her because Ida can't really teach her anything. But it also explores why she doesn't like the school. I like her conversations with Bump, as well as the surprise that he actually would be cool with Luz joining the school, which makes him a more interesting and dynamic character going forward. Also, you get a nice scene between Luz and Ida at the end that really fleshes out their relationship more. With all these good things, the one issue that holds it back from being any higher on the list is while I like the setup and a lot of the story beats, I just don't find the main conflict between Gus and Bartholomew super interesting, as Bartholomew is just a boring bully, and I don't find Gus's struggle throughout the episode super interesting either, along with, once again, his issues just kind of being spelled out and stated at the end. Look, I promise the show can do interesting themes and messages in a subtle way. It does in many other episodes this season, including some we've talked about, and even in this one it does with Ida and Luz at the end. But even with that issue, there's just so much good here that I still really like it, even if there are still 11 that are better. Another Hexside-centered episode, and the first really good episode of the show. After 2 episodes of messing around, this episode feels like it really nails the characterization of Eda, King, and Luce. It's not as good as some future episodes, and they're not as fleshed out, but the character writing in general is really good here and a lot better than what's come before, including characters introduced like Amity. I know she acts differently here than she does later, and is not as fleshed out, but this is a great introduction to her. She could have been just a boring bully, which would have made her changing perspective on Luce in later episodes not as interesting, but right from the get-go, she's a pretty fun and interesting character. She can be stuck up and mean, but you can tell she really loves magic, and is not only good at it, but had to work really hard to get that great. She is so prideful that she looks down on witches like Willow who aren't as good, and you learn these little details throughout this conflict. She's a fun antagonist because of how much she cares about proving Willow is cheating on her project for these reasons, and this leads to many great interactions between her and the other main characters. This is also a really good introduction to Willow and Gus, who aren't my favorite characters, but are great companions for Luce, and both get great episodes later on. And the episode does a really good job endearing you to both of them, but especially makes you feel for Willow, who is in a class she doesn't enjoy when her talents and interests lie elsewhere. I guess that leads me to the other big thing that this episode does right, and that is the story is good and a lot of fun. While nothing too flashy, it really does play around with the cliches involving magic schools and fantasy worlds. It does a lot of fun things with this, through Luce being the only human there and having to stay hidden to succeed with this plan and not get caught. There are some cool scenes learning about the school and how magic works in this world, along with some funny moments. And as I said, you want them to succeed in this plan because Willow has a great motivation for going along with this, and Luce just wants to see more of the school and hang out with people learning magic who are her age, and going through with this plan is the only way to do it. And she is just so likable here for this reason. The story also has some good twists and turns, which leads to a really fun ending sequence. Once again, this is a really good episode overall, but what holds it back is the subplot is only alright, even if King and Eda are pretty funny here. The arc our main characters go through and the message of this episode are good, but nothing super special. It's the one part of the story I'm not super crazy about, as the outcome is a bit simple and not super interesting. But that doesn't still mean it's not a good and satisfying one. And the episode can be a little simple at points for this reason. But overall, this is still a pretty strong one. Thank you guys so much for watching this far into the list. If you have enjoyed it so far, please leave a like and subscribe to stay updated for when part 2 is gonna come out, which will be within the next 2 weeks. Also, leave a comment down below on what you've thought of my choices in this video, along with what your own list would be, and how you think the top 10 of this season will be ordered. Also, tell me what you thought of For the Future. By the time this video is up, I will have watched it and would love to know what you guys think, because it looks great. Also, to all the other people who didn't watch the leak, nothing but support. Anyways, part 2 will be out shortly, and until next time, this is Chocolate Guy, signing off.